is The Roger Stone Show.
Welcome into the Stone Zone right here on The Roger Stone Show. You know, for more than 50 years, the political establishment, the liberal media, of course, academic historians, and far too many weak-kneed, lily-livered, country club, white wine swilling Republicans have repeated the same dishonest caricature of one Richard Milhouse Nixon. They told Americans that Nixon was a sinister, paranoid, power-hungry president whose resignation proved the righteousness of the Washington, D.C. establishment. Well, they were wrong. They reduced one of the most consequential presidents of the 20th century to a third-rate hotel burglary that he neither planned nor authorized. They ignored his enormous accomplishments, they concealed the misconduct of his enemies, and they conveniently forgot the cowardice of the Republican leaders who abandoned him when he needed him the most. Now, interestingly enough, a half-century later, an entire new generation is discovering the truth about Richard Nixon, thanks to articles in the Wall Street Journal and a couple of days ago in the Daily Wire. There's a new phenomenon. It's called Nixonmaxxing. You see, two brilliant young gentlemen at the Nixon Foundation, James Byron, the president and chief executive officer of the Nixon Foundation, and a young man named Chris Barber, have embarked on a brilliant net-based campaign using Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, X, and the like to introduce an entire new generation of people, young people, to Richard Nixon, using archival speeches, photographs, interviews, campaign memorabilia. There's now, incredibly, a growing fascination with Nixon's unmistakable 1960s style, and young people are reconsidering a man they were taught to despise. Now they see a president who was tough, intelligent, disciplined, patriotic, and willing to challenge the permanent political class. They see a man who rose from poverty through determination and hard work, endured repeated political defeats and setbacks, and returned each time stronger than the time before. They finally see the Richard Nixon I knew, a leader who understood the forgotten Americans long before the consultants in Washington discovered that they even existed. So to those now experiencing this Nixon awakening, I have only one thing to say. I told you so. I was there. I worked for Richard Nixon. I knew the man behind the grotesque media caricature, and he was nothing like the monster portrayed by the professional Nixon haters. Richard Nixon was a fundamentally good and decent man, and he was, in fact, a truly great president. He loved his wife, Pat. He loved his daughters. He loved his country. He was generous to friends, loyal to those who served him, and deeply moved by the struggles of ordinary Americans because he had lived those struggles himself. You see, unlike John Kennedy, who I admire for other reasons, Richard Nixon was not born into wealth or privilege. There was no family fortune waiting for him, no political elite dynasty clearing his path, no fashionable social circle to embrace or further his ambitions. He came from Yorba Linda, California, grew up in a family of modest means, worked in his parents' grocery store, attended Whittier College, earned a place at Duke University Law School. Later, after his presidency, Duke University refused to receive his papers. He served in the United States Navy during World War II, and he built a career through intelligence, perseverance, and capacity for work that astonished even those closest to him. Think about this for a moment. He went from being discharged from the Navy in 1946, and just 6 years later, he was vice president of the United States. In other words, actually discharged in 1945, elected to Congress in 1946, re-elected in 1948, elected to the United States Senate in 1950, and then selected to be on the ticket with Dwight Eisenhower in 1952. 6 years from being a complete and totally unknown to the second most powerful position in the world. He was not polished in the manner preferred by the Georgetown cocktail circuit. He didn't have the physical grace or the gravitas of John Kennedy, nor his inherited wealth. He wasn't glamorous, and he most certainly did not have a fawning press corps. In fact, because Richard Nixon turned out to be right about the fact that Alger Hiss, one of the top advisors to Franklin Roosevelt, was indeed a communist spy, he was forever despised by the permanent media establishment. Nixon was awkward because he was human. He was cautious because he'd been attacked. He was suspicious because many of the people surrounding him really were conspiring against him. History has proved his enemies were not imaginary. They occupied newsrooms, congressional offices, congressional agencies, universities, and even senior positions in our courts. We learned only later that the Central Intelligence Agency was well aware of the Watergate break-in advance, that they infiltrated the Watergate break-in team, that 4 of the 8 Watergate bloggers are still on the active payroll of the CIA. We also learned that John Dean was the man who planned, pushed, covered up, and orchestrated the Watergate break-in, only to then decide that he would reinvent himself as a whistleblower, and then he lied to Richard Nixon, based on the tapes, for 19 straight months, misleading him about how high the conspiracy went. It was Dean himself who ran the Watergate operation. There have been multiple books written on this subject, the best of them probably James Haugen's Hidden Agenda, but also James Rosen's The Strong Man, a biography of John Mitchell, White House Call Girl by Phil Stanford. But all of those books have largely been suppressed, and none of them have ever been widely circulated. But the truth is there if you want to find it. Today's young conservatives recognize the pattern because they've watched the same machinery deployed against Donald Trump. They've seen intelligence officers manipulate information, prosecutors twist laws, bureaucrats leak classified material, congressional investigators conduct partisan inquisitions, and media organizations publish accusations first and corrections never. What was done to Nixon with mimeograph machines, anonymous sources, secret grand juries, the judge meeting illegally with prosecutors, and television networks has been done to Trump with social media censorship, weaponized investigations, surveillance, lawfare, and 24-hour cable propaganda. The technology has changed, but the tactics have not, and the establishment has not. Richard Nixon's presidency was far more successful than his critics want to admit. You see, that's why it's important to get beyond Watergate to talk about his actual record. He inherited the Vietnam War from Lyndon Johnson, and he brought it to a close, bringing our troops home. He ended the military draft and replaced it with an all-volunteer force. He gave us the 18-year-old vote. He pursued détente with the Soviet Union while negotiating a historic strategic arms limitation agreement from a position of strength. And his opening to China transformed global diplomacy, reshaped the balance of power for generations. Those who criticize Richard Nixon for opening the door to China don't seem to understand that at the time that Nixon opened the door to China, China was a dirt-poor, backwards, agrarian society where few had indoor plumbing, where the rural areas had no electrification. Their military and their economy were neither formidable. It wasn't until 30 years later that President Bill Clinton gave them most favored nation trading status, and that is what made them the dangerous enemy and world superpower that they are today. Richard Nixon also saved Israel during the Yom Kippur War, authorizing the massive resupply operation that saved the Jewish state from annihilation, and he demonstrated that American friendship meant something when that moment of danger arrived. He also desegregated the public schools without incident. Now, Richard Nixon was the most successful president, but because the media won't let us get beyond Watergate, it is virtually impossible to assess his presidency. Now, an entire new generation of younger Americans are doing so. At home, Nixon spoke for the silent majority, the working men and women who obeyed the laws, paid their taxes, raised their families, served their countries, and received nothing but contempt from the elites and the radical left for doing so. He understood that Americans were exhausted by riots, political violence, campaign chaos, and the cultural arrogance of elites who considered patriotism to be uncool or unsophisticated. His campaigns built a durable political coalition that, by appealing to voters abandoned by the Democratic Party, that same coalition would go on to help elect Ronald Reagan, and decades later it is the same coalition that elected Donald Trump. Nixon also, of course, signed landmark environmental legislation. He established the Environmental Protection Agency. He expanded protections for endangered species. He supported very significant conservation measures. And as I say, he advanced the desegregation of Southern schools, actually all schools, more effectively than many of the liberal politicians who received credit for civil rights progress. Here's a little-known fact. Richard Nixon appointed more African Americans to federal office than Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy combined. But you won't read that in the New York Times or the Washington Post. His administration increased federal funding for historically black colleges and universities. He signed Title IX, which transformed educational opportunities for women. See, these accomplishments don't fit the cartoon version of Nixon, which is precisely why they're so often omitted. The architects of Nixon's destruction could not defeat his record, so they destroyed his presidency. Watergate was a sloppy burglary committed by men exercising astonishingly poor judgment. But Richard Nixon did not order the break-in of the Watergate. There was no reason to do so. He did not know about it in advance, and when the scandal erupted, he made the catastrophic mistake of trusting men who were more interested in protecting themselves than protecting the president. The investigation metastasized into a national crusade in which normal standards of fairness were discarded, and every institution in Washington joined the hunt to destroy Richard Milhous Nixon. Now, thanks to these young men at the Nixon Foundation, Richard Nixon is getting the historic reappraisal that he so richly deserves. And all I can say is, I told you so. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to the Stone Zone right here on the Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Audio Networks. And when we come back, I'll tell you why I have a tattoo of Richard Nixon on my back and what it means to me when I see it in the mirror every single morning.
This is the Roger Stone Show. This is the Roger Stone Show.
A man who's gone through hell, but he's kept going, and he's smart, and he's strong, and people love him. Not everybody, but people love him and respect him. Roger Stone.
Now, here's Roger Stone.
Welcome back into the Stone Zone right here on the Roger Stone Show. It was really J.D. Vance, the vice president, who kind of kicked off this Nixon revival when he said in a speech at the Nixon Library that he believed that the same dark forces who took down Richard Nixon attempted unsuccessfully to destroy Donald Trump. Donald Trump himself has asked me numerous times why Nixon quit, why he didn't fight onward. And the answer is, of course, that there was no internet at the time. We had a monolithic media, 3 television networks. There were no national newspapers, but very influential news magazines like Newsweek, Time, Life, and Look, and they were, to an organ, they were dedicated to his destruction. So he had no platform from which to launch a counterattack. Now, there's a direct line from the destruction of Richard Nixon to the establishment attempts to destroy Donald Trump. The forces that destroyed Nixon expected Trump to respond as Nixon had responded. They expected him to accept the judgment of hostile institutions, retreat for the supposed good of the country, allow Washington, D.C. to return to business as usual. Well, they completely and totally misunderstood Donald Trump. They had studied the lessons of Nixon's, but they had reached the wrong conclusions. Never resign, never surrender, never believe that appeasing your enemies will cause them to treat you fairly. Nixon believed that resigning in the end would spare the country a prolonged constitutional crisis. He didn't have the one thing that Donald Trump had, and that was a platform, the internet, with which to counterattack and defend himself. In Nixon's case, it was an act of personal sacrifice by a man who placed the nation above his own power. His enemies interpreted that sacrifice as an admission of every accusation they made against him, but they were wrong. They spent the next 5 decades writing the history books, producing the movies, teaching the college courses, and constructing the Woodward and Bernstein mythology, which is a fraud. And now the American people are learning that. They saw a world in which they were the heroes and Nixon was the villain. But history has a very long memory, and truth has an inconvenient habit of surviving. Young Americans now are watching Nixon speak again, are discovering a leader of extraordinary depth. There are his warnings about political violence, media power, bureaucratic arrogance, cultural decline, and the dangers of a ruling class that is disconnected from ordinary citizens. They see his command of foreign policy and they compare it with the shallow slogans that are offered by modern politicians. They see his resilience after defeat, his discipline under pressure, and his refusal to apologize for loving America. They also recognize something else. The old establishment historians will never understand. Nixon was interesting. He was complicated. He was brilliant. He was funny in a dry and often self-deprecating way. He possessed an extraordinary understanding of human nature, internal strategy, and political power. Yes, I have a tattoo of Richard Nixon on my back. It's about equidistance between my shoulder blades, about the size of a pineapple. And it is there not as a political statement, but as a daily reminder that in life, when you get knocked down, when you suffer defeats, when you suffer setbacks, that is the time to dust yourself off, get up off the mat, and get back in the fight. You see, the story of Richard Nixon is an American story. It's a story of persistence. It's a story of resilience. It's a story of survival. It is Richard Nixon's story. It is my story. It is Donald Trump's story. And it is America's story. I'm Roger Stone. We'll be right back.
This is The Roger Stone Show.
Welcome back into the Stone Zone right here on The Roger Stone Show. When I saw President Donald Trump's address to the nation on Thursday night, and he said that the Communist Chinese had obtained approximately 220 million U.S. voter files beginning during the 2020 election cycle, I knew that the guest I wanted for today's show was journalist Gordon Chang. Gordon Chang is, shall we say, an old China hand, although not that old. He lived and worked in Shanghai and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades, has been a columnist for Newsweek, Newsmaxx, has written regularly for The Hill, The Wall Street Journal, and others. He's the author of numerous excellent books on China, but his most recent book, Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America, is available today on Amazon. And you can follow him on X at Gordon G. Chang. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much, Roger.
So let me start here. Given the scale of China's reported acquisition of voter data from multiple states, how do you assess whether this represents primarily an intelligence collection effort for long-term targeting of U.S. elites, maybe the diaspora communities here, and swing voters, or is it more likely a foundational step towards more active influence operations like, I don't know, micro-targeting, disinformation, or proxy voting registration? In other words, Gordon Chang, what do you make of this?
Well, all of the above, Roger. There are a couple things going on. So first of all, China just hoovers up all the information about the United States that it can because it feeds it into its AI systems. It tries to come up with a big picture of the United States. And China has more data about us than perhaps the federal government does. But what they do, and you suggested it, they use this data about individuals. They cross-reference it. They're looking for people who are vulnerable, people who they can turn, people who will provide information and do other things for Beijing. And so, for instance, it's not just voter data. And when we looked at the attacks on the networks of the Office of Personnel Management, also going through insurance records at Anthem, they're looking for people who need money or who are somewhat vulnerable for one or another reason. So, yes, this just adds to their picture of Americans that they can target.
So after the president's disclosures highlighting China's acquiring this document, How might the CCP integrate the voter data with its United Front Work Department activities? In other words, are we looking at AI-driven analytics to shape future U.S. election narratives, suppress turnout, or is this something much, much broader?
Well, I think it's certainly for those two things that you mentioned, and for, I'm sure, other things as well. We know that the party has a comprehensive plan to assault America. They use the Communist Party's United Front Work Department, which is the part of the party that subverts foreign governments. So, yes, I'm sure that they have all sorts of uses for that data.
If you're just tuning in, we're talking to Gordon Chang. You can follow him on X at Gordon G. Chang. He's an outstanding author, and he is my go-to guy when it comes to any question regarding China. He's written numerous books. His latest book, Plan Red, China's Plan to Destroy America, is available right now on Amazon. Cannot recommend it to you highly enough. Gordon, what is your assessment regarding the current political stability in China? There have been reports of instability within the Chinese Communist Party. There's been reports of tensions between the Chinese military and the Chinese leadership. What is your assessment in this regard?
If we look at the civilian part of the party, I think that Xi Jinping has been able to overcome a very difficult patch that he had last year. On the military side of things, and remember the Chinese military reports to the Communist Party, not to the Chinese central government. On the military side of things, I think things have gotten worse. There's been all sorts of purges, including China's #1 most senior uniformed officer, General Zhang Yaoxiao, who was put under investigation in January of this year. There are a lot of people who will say, Roger, that because Xi Jinping fires people, that he's in control of the military. I can understand the argument, but the fact that he is continually firing people, and he's been doing this for more than a decade now, that shows that he's not in control of the military. Because if he were in control of the military, he wouldn't have to fire people. So I think we have a military which is resisting Xi Jinping. On the Communist Party's Central Military Commission, which controls the military, there's normally 7 seats. Only 2 of them now are filled. One of them is Xi Jinping himself, and the second is a general who is a political commissar. In other words, there are no operational officers left on the Central Military Commission. And that shows you the disarray in the Chinese military at this moment.
What would you say of the combat readiness of today's Chinese military? In other words, putting aside the political questions or even the timing, are they capable of launching an effort to seize Taiwan at this point? Do they have the readiness or the capability to do that?
That's a really important question. If you're talking about nuclear weapons, yes, they can turn Taiwan into a radioactive slab and then just walk in. But if you're talking about conventional weapons only, I think the answer is probably no. And the reason is that in order for China to take Taiwan, they have to do something that they've never done in Chinese history, which is a combined air-land-sea operation. It takes enormous coordination. And as I just mentioned, you have at the top all of these officers who have been disappeared. And you need to have that coordination in order to have a successful invasion. If you're talking about something less ambitious, yes, China is able to do things. So, for instance, there are islands of Taiwan which are no more than 3 or 4 miles from the main Chinese coast. So, for instance, the island of Kinmen, which is just off of Fujian province. There, the Chinese can walk in anytime they want. And that's even despite the political disarray, because those are not hard military operations. But if you're talking about the things that we worry about, the main island of Taiwan, that's 110 miles of water. That is very difficult to cross.
Do most Americans underestimate the extent of Chinese communist espionage going on in this country today?
Yes. And we just saw that from what the president said. 220 million voter files. I mean, that's an astounding number when you consider that's about the same number of U.S. voters. So really what we're talking about is a comprehensive effort. And in general, we do not understand the comprehensive nature of China's assault on us or the maliciousness of the Chinese regime. And that is very dangerous for us.
You make an excellent point. The country, as I understand, is riddled with their own police stations, which are ostensibly here for the purposes of policing Chinese citizens in the United States, but who I suspect's involvement in espionage is far, far broader.
Yes.
The other thing here that continues to amaze me is the way that our government continues to allow the Chinese to acquire assets within this country, either directly nor indirectly. If you go to the U.S. Department of Agriculture's most recent report on how much farm or ranch land is owned by Chinese interests, not only do I think it's inaccurate, I think it's woefully underestimating those efforts. To what do you ascribe the fact that we don't seem to have the national will to end China from buying us up? I keep hearing that phrase that China will take over this country without firing a shot, as long as they are, I would say, infiltrating every strata of American society, whether it's academia, whether it is business, whether it's the Fortune 500 companies. I mean, this seems to me to be the real danger.
Yes, well, first of all, you're absolutely right about the underreporting, because a lot of Chinese buy agricultural or ranch land with cash, and they do not report it to the U.S. Commerce Department, and that means the U.S. Agriculture Department doesn't get accurate numbers. On your answer to your question, we're Americans, which means we've got a democracy, and democracies historically have been slow to react to dangers. And this is something that we can go back to Tocqueville in the 19th century, and he wrote about it, or we can go to the 20th century, where you have the great geopolitical strategist from Britain, John Halford Mackinder, talk about how democracies are so slow to react. Plus, we've got another couple problems, and that is after the Cold War, we felt that history had ended, as Francis Fukuyama said, so we all went to sleep. And we thought that we could engage China, integrate it into the international system, and as we did that, we allowed China to create basically segments of the U.S. population that were beholden to China because of economic investment or whatever ties. So there are a lot of reasons for our inability to deal with China, but we got to start waking up, because the Chinese are not slowing down.
Folks, if you're just tuning in, we're talking to journalist Gordon Chang. You can find him at Gordon G. Chang on X. You can find his profile at Gordon G. Chang. Once again, all of his books are outstanding. His most recent book, Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America, now available on Amazon. I highly recommend it to you. Gordon, what would you say about the current relationship between Russia and China? In our opening segment, we talked about Richard Nixon's very skillful playing them off against each other in order to win a strategic arms limitation agreement back in the 70s. They are a country, although at one time both considered to be quote-unquote communist, they share a long border and hundreds of years of distrust. If Joe Biden seemed to me to achieve anything, he appears to have pushed them together.
Well, what we've got with China and Russia are two countries whose they see their interests generally the same way. So, for instance, in the war in Ukraine, China has supported Russia across the board. There are Chinese mercenaries fighting for Russia, and there are officers of the People's Liberation Army at the front in Ukraine. So this is a multidimensional relationship. I know that a lot of people say, and they're quite correct, we don't have to worry about China and Russia, in the long run. So if we're talking the 2060s or 2070s, I'm sure that's correct. But we're talking about the 2020s. And right now, we see these two nations work very closely. They've got their problems. That was evident when basically Beijing shut down the negotiations with Russia over the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline. That certainly hurt Russia, but it also hurt China as well. And I think that Xi Jinping made a big mistake in not carrying through with those negotiations. So there are problems in the relationship, but in general, I think that Putin is more important in that relationship than most people think. And the reason is Putin is willing to do things that China would like to do, but feels it shouldn't do. So, for instance, destabilizing the international system, taking on the United States. These are things Xi Jinping would love to do, and Putin is doing it, which is the reason why, in general, China is supporting Russia across the board.
Excellent analysis. Folks, once again, if you're just tuning in, we're talking to Gordon Chang, journalist, author of Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America, which you can get at Amazon now. I highly recommend all of his books. I like China is Going to War. That was among your books. That was one of my favorites. Once again, you can follow Gordon at Gordon G. Chang on X. I asked Gordon here today for his expert analysis on this breaking news that the Communist Chinese had accessed 220 million U.S. voter files, which Gordon Chang correctly points out is about the number of voters in the United States. We're going to continue with Gordon Chang on the other side. You're listening to the Stone Zone right here on The Roger Stone Show, and we'll be right back.
Now, it's time for Protecting Your Future, sponsored by American Sovereign Bullion. Here's Roger Stone.
This is Roger Stone, and it's time for Protecting Your Future. When uncertainty rises, smart investors look for stability. For generations, gold and silver have helped protect purchasing power through inflation, market swings, and economic uncertainty and turbulence. Learn how precious metals like gold and silver can help diversify and protect what matters most to you, your financial future. Start building your financial foundation today by going to dyingdollar.com. That's dyingdollar.com. You'll be glad you did.
This is The Roger Stone Show.
This is Roger Stone, and I want you to try this. Pull a dollar out of your wallet. Look at it. Since the Federal Reserve was created, that dollar has lost 97 cents of its value. 97 cents. You've watched it happen your whole working life. I'm Roger Stone, and I'm done watching. Visit RogerStonesGold.com right now. The Dying Dollar Guide explains what's coming next, and it's free. Go to RogerStonesGold.com. Read it before you forget. RogerStonesGold.com.
This is The Roger Stone Show.
A man who's gone through hell, but he's kept going, and he's smart, and he's strong, and people love him. Not everybody, but people love him and respect him. Roger Stone.
Now, here's Roger Stone.
And we're back in the Roger Stone Show. We're talking to journalist Gordon Chang. He is the author of Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. He is long reported from both Shanghai and Hong Kong, and I think is probably the single most knowledgeable journalist in the country on all things communist China. Here's a more esoteric question for you, Gordon. By the way, you can follow Gordon at Gordon G. Chang on X. That's Gordon G. Chang. I recommend that you do so. And when I saw that the president was announcing this breach of $220 million voter files, I immediately wanted Gordon for today's show, and I'm grateful to him for joining us. Gordon, here's a more esoteric question. The president has defended the hundreds of thousands of Chinese students here on student visas, although I think that I have some trepidation about that. How do you feel on that question? And then to a broader question, if the president called you in the next 20 minutes and said, Gordon, what's your advice on how to handle the threat of China, what would you say?
Thanks, Roger. First of all, the president wanted to essentially double the number of Chinese nationals in our colleges and universities. I don't think so. I don't think that's a good idea. And the reason is, first of all, there's a lot of espionage that those students commit. They committed at the direction of Ministry of State security agents and Chinese consular officials in our country. And that is an enormous issue because perhaps 13% of them engage in illegal espionage. Also, just more generally, and this is not just Chinese students, but this is students from other countries, and that is every place that is taken by a foreign student means one fewer place for an American. And we know that the Chinese are concentrated in the STEM topics, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. This is where we need to teach our young. So I worry about that. And if the president were to call in 20 minutes, I would just say this. I think I would say that, look, we have to understand how dangerous the Chinese regime is and how fast Beijing is moving. Xi Jinping talks about going to war all the time. We need the president of the United States to talk to the American people to get ourselves ready. Because if we get ourselves ready, the worst won't happen. You talked about those secret police stations on American soil. Yes, the FBI closed one of them in Chinatown in New York City, but according to the New York Post and the Daily Caller, there are about 7 to 9 more in the United States spread all across the country. We've already found 2 Chinese biological weapons labs and facilities on our soil. God knows what else is going on. We see the Chinese with these drones over our military bases. We just have to act very fast to roll up these Chinese networks.
Yeah, but there's no question we need to be more aggressive. Even in legislation passed in my home state of Florida, which on the surface of it appears to restrict the Chinese from acquiring lands here, when you read the small print, it is limited to lands that are next to a quote-unquote national security facility, although that is not defined anyplace else in the law. Not even sure what that means. We have about a minute left. I want to remind folks about your new book, Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. You can find that on Amazon. I strongly recommend that to you. All of Gordon's books are most excellent. And follow him on X. He's at Gordon G. Chang. Gordon, we have 1 minute left. Your final thought.
Well, the most important thing right now is to realize how fast the Chinese are moving. I think that Xi Jinping is in trouble at home, as you talked about, and I think that he believes that causing problems abroad are in his personal interest, not to rally the Chinese people because they don't want war, but to make sure that other Communist Party figures don't challenge him. So he can lash out and he can be very dangerous.
All right, there you have it. I want to thank my guest, Gordon Chang. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to The Roger Stone Show, and we'll be right back.
This is The Roger Stone Show.
Welcome back into the Stone Zone right here on The Roger Stone Show. When I saw the president's address in which he announced that 220 million U.S. voter files had been acquired by the communist Chinese, I knew that one of the guests that I wanted for today's show was one of the single most brilliant election law lawyers in the country today. That is Cleta Mitchell. Cleta Mitchell has practiced law for more than 30 years with experience in law, politics, and public policy. She advises corporations, nonprofit organizations, candidates, campaigns, and individuals on state and federal and election campaign finance law. She is the expert. That's why I'm anxious to get her opinion. Cleta, welcome into the Stone Zone.
Well, I'm very honored to be here.
So I guess let's start from the top. What is your assessment of this breach of 220 million voter files? What do you think they were doing with them or plan to do with them? And how do we make sure this doesn't happen again or doesn't continue to happen?
Well, gosh, there's so much to unpack about this. Let's start with the fact that it is a violation of U.S. law for a foreign nation to obtain voter records from our country. They are not supposed to purchase them. And in this case, clearly, my understanding from, and of course I haven't had a chance to read all the documents are unclassified by the president, but my understanding from talking with John Solomon and others, is that they decided, the Chinese Communists decided, this is before the 2020 election, that they didn't want to just acquire the publicly available information, which is illegal for them to acquire. So they hacked into systems all across the country to acquire the data, all of the non-public data, which, by the way, let me just point out, these states are refusing to give to the United States Department of Justice, but the Chinese Communists have the data. And once you have that data of all of the voter records, and you know proprietary information, you know the vote history, you know if people vote by mail, you know if they vote in person. And I want to tell you, Roger, one of the things that I learned after the election 2020, I was sent by President Trump in the White House to Georgia. And I literally I arrived 2 days after the election, and we ended up filing an election contest, never had a judge appointed. That was an interesting thing. Never happened in my experience as a lawyer that you file a lawsuit and you don't get a judge appointed to hear the case, and we never heard. So when they say the president lost all his lawsuits, he didn't lose ours because he never had his day in court. But the point I was going to make is that we had all of these reports in Georgia about people who showed up to vote on Election Day, to vote in person, and were told, "Oh, Mrs. Smith, we show that you've already voted by mail." Mrs. Smith replies, "I never vote by mail. I always vote in person." "Well, Mrs. Smith, we show that you voted already, and so we'll have to give you a provisional ballot." Well, guess what? Mrs. Smith has to come back and prove within 3 days that she didn't vote. Well, how do you prove a negative? How do you prove something you don't even have any idea how it happened? I thought we had thousands of those in Georgia. I thought it was just Georgia because that's what I was working in. A year later, I was giving a speech in August of 2021 in Virginia at our first statewide election integrity summit. We started in August of 2021 and had throughout 2022. And I was giving a speech, and I talked about this phenomenon of people showing up to vote and being told they already voted. All these hands shot up in the audience saying, that happened here, that happened here. What I began to realize, it happened everywhere in the country. Roger, I've never heard about that before or since. Something happened. And because we were silenced after 2020, we were not allowed to talk about problems and anomalies and situations in 2020. This was never investigated, and I believe very strongly after seeing and hearing about what it was that the Chinese Communists obtained, that this was something that they were responsible for. They were casting ballots by mail in the names of people who they knew would vote in person, so their votes would not count. Because guess who votes in person on Election Day? Republicans, Trump supporters. That's just one thing, but there were tens of thousands of those all over the country. That's just one thing. So, look, I mean, I think that there are so many things that they did, but the most amazing, disgusting things to me is that the President of the United States gave a nationwide speech to talk about foreign attacks on our election system, and we have networks who decide that that's not newsworthy. That's not newsworthy. That the communist Chinese had plans to and did disrupt elections in 2020, and the people at the highest levels of the CIA and the FBI in January 2020 decided to manipulate the data and not tell the president, and they don't think that's newsworthy. I'm telling you, there's something very, very seriously wrong here. Very seriously wrong on both counts.
No, you make an excellent point. I mean, all of the networks carried Joe Biden's speech in which he essentially declared that anyone who disagreed with him politically in the country was a dangerous extremist. That was a very dark speech. A very dark speech.
It was horrendous, and it was saying that if you're a patriot who loves this country, and you think that there were things that were problems in the 2020 election, then you're a danger to the country? I don't think so. And now then what I want to say, honestly, is, well, if you're not surprised by this, Mr. Network, you don't think this is newsworthy, that means that you must have already known. So what did you know and when did you know it?
What I really loved, and I saw you doing this online, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on today, is you saw Mark Elias, who is the ringleader for corrupt elections on the left, and many others on the left. Before they even knew what it was that President Trump was going to say in his speech, they were already out trying to debunk it. In other words, whatever Trump is saying is not true, is not legitimate. I give the left credit. In other words, they don't say, well, there may have been some minor voter fraud, but it was never enough to actually change the results of the elections. Instead, they say, no, there's no evidence whatsoever anywhere, at any level, in any state, of any discrepancies or anomalies or irregularities. And if you say so, you need to be silenced. You're a criminal and you need to be silenced. And they actually, to a certain extent, they got away with that. And now, of course, that narrative is falling apart before our very eyes. I guess the most important question I want to ask is one that the President did not address in his remarks. But I have, just based on everything I have read and seen on my own now, I'm not a computer scientist and I'm not a lawyer, but I have real reservations about the security and the reliability of these electronic voting machines. First, they told us that they were not connected to the internet. In many, many cases, it turns out that they are. There are many allegations about irregularities and vote switching in these electronic machines. What, Cleta, is your opinion?
Well, look, I will tell you, we were preparing the lawsuit for the election contest in Georgia. We ended up not including anything about the voting machines because we had to do it very quickly because there's a very, the clock is ticking when you're preparing an election contest. And we didn't have any experts. We needed to be ready to go to trial the moment we filed the lawsuit. And I am someone, and I said to our team, we had a team of volunteer attorneys, because, of course, all the people who are being paid, honestly, by the Trump campaign and RNC wouldn't touch any of this with a 10-foot pole. Just remember that little fact. Yeah. And so we were working on this lawsuit, and I finally looked around the table at our volunteers, our volunteer lawyers, and I said, look, I'm not an expert on this. I can barely work my iPhone. But I said, so we didn't know. And so we didn't include anything. But fast forward, I've spent 5 years with people around the country working on election issues. And what I've come to conclude is this. I can tell you 2 or 3 facts that are just basic facts. Number one, Congress, after the 2000 election in Florida, the Bush-Gore election, the Congress, the Democrats insisted, of course, we had a Republican Congress, but the Republicans went along with what the Democrats wanted to do, which is often the case, and they passed a law that told every state, you've got to get rid of the old lever machines, you've got to get rid of the punch card systems. And that started the process of getting these electronic voting machines. And there are people that I have come to know and admire and respect who started immediately after that law passed and said, this is a recipe for disaster. These are not secure systems. And so for the last, the first system that was certified, the standards for certification were adopted in 2005. And that is the voluntary voting system guidelines issued by the Election Assistance Commission. That's 1.0, VVSG 1.0, Voluntary Voting System Guidelines 1.0, issued in 2005. They did not issue new guidelines for the electronic voting systems until February of 2021. And there is not a single system in use in America today that meets the standards from February of 2021. No system meets the standards. from 5 years ago. Now, I want to ask you, do you think that any system, a laptop, a phone, anything that was certified in 2005, that we would think that that's worth anything today? So let's just start with that. That's the fact. Let's also start with the fact that there's not a single system in use in America today that is not manufactured in whole or in part in China. This is our foreign adversary. Why are we using equipment, technology, that is manufactured in whole or in part in China? So I want to tell you that I think that this is a very serious situation. I think the president has issued the information, the documentation that these are vulnerable, and that now what we have to do, there needs to be an all-of-government approach to addressing this vulnerability and this challenge to our critical infrastructure, which includes elections. And that requires an all-government approach.
Cleta, we have to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back in the Stone Zone.
This is the Roger Stone Show. This is the Roger Stone Show.
A man who's gone through hell, but he's kept going, and he's smart, and he's strong, and people love him. Not everybody, but people love him and respect him. Roger Stone.
Now, here's Roger Stone.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. We've got about 4 minutes left. We're talking to Cleta Mitchell, without any question, one of the most brilliant election law lawyers in the country, who for more than 30 years has represented corporations, nonprofits, candidates, campaigns, but a solid conservative and a great woman. And I'm very pleased that you were able to join us today, Cleta. I guess my question here is, looking at the 2026 elections, if you could wave a magic wand to ensure that our next elections, our next federal elections, are honest, fair, and free, what would you do?
Well, the first thing I would do is require that we vote on hand-marked paper ballots, pre-printed on security paper, hand-marked paper ballots, pre-printed on security paper, that people would mostly vote in person at precincts. People would be assigned to precincts based on where they live, so you would know exactly how many ballots were needed in a given precinct, because people would be registered and they would vote in those precincts, voting in person. And the only people who would be voting by mail would be people who had an inability to get to the polls to vote in person. And you would have to have three or four reasons why you wouldn't be able. You're in the hospital, you live in a disability facility, you're traveling, you're not in the jurisdiction on election day. But so that we would know who is there and voting, that we would have the opportunity to review all the voter rolls in advance, make sure that everybody on the rolls is eligible, lives in the precinct, isn't dead, is a citizen, isn't a felon, and that we would restore the integrity of the process. And then we would vote on, I am not somebody who says we ought to hand count everything. We're not hand counting ballots. We're hand counting what I guess I would say, I've heard some election officials say we're hand counting ovals. And, one election precinct may have, 30, 40, 50 issues and candidates, state, local, federal, ballot issues. So I'm not somebody who is, bowing at the altar of hand counting, but I am somebody who believes in hand marking. And then the tabulation process, even if we use an electronic tabulator, we need to reconcile to make sure that the number of ballots that are issued at that precinct match the number of voters who showed up to vote. I mean, just basic accounting. They do it at the grocery store every day. You balance the cash store. They do it at the bank. The teller has to, make sure that the numbers match. And we have gotten so far away from the numbers matching. Let's not forget the goal is to have an accurate election. Accurate. And the left has destroyed these basic principles, and we get back to that. But I would not use the voting machines. I would use hand-marked paper ballots. I would make sure that we had, as most people voting in person, we would have reconciliation at the precincts before certification, so you know that the ballots issued match the number of voters. And then, let the chips fall where they may. But this is what we've got now is a situation that goes back to Tammany Hall and the ward healers and things we got rid of 100 years ago, Roger. 100 years ago.
All right. We have to leave it there. I want to thank our guest, Cleta Mitchell. You can find her on X at Cleta Mitchell. That's Cleta Mitchell. Check her out and make sure you follow her. Cleta, thanks for joining us. We'll be right back.
World Wildlife Fund at wwf.org/love.
This is The Roger Stone Show.
Welcome back into the Stone Zone, right here on The Roger Stone Show. This is the segment we call the Political Roundtable. Joining me now, the editor and publisher of Slingshot.News, Troy Smith. Troy, first I wanted to get your thoughts on the incredible re-examination of one Richard Milhouse Nixon, the phenomena known online as Nixonmaxxing. Now, I know among our older listeners, they're going to be, I would say, pretty polarized. They're going to those who still hate Tricky Dick and think that he was a criminal who caused the greatest single constitutional crisis in our history. Others realize he was a dedicated American and anti-communist who was among our greatest presidents. But now an entire new, younger generation of Americans get introduced to Richard Nixon without all that backstory, and hopefully they can now focus on his actual accomplishments as president.
Well, absolutely, Roger. And when we look at those accomplishments, they are vast. I think the proof in Nixon is the lengths to which the deep state, the same deep state that attempted to oust President Donald Trump with impeachment in the first term, in his first term, whether it be, the deep state that has done so much over the years here, that same deep state went to great lengths to make sure that Richard Nixon was not going to be president anymore. And that alone tells you that his impact was tremendous. And I think the Nixon foreign policy that we saw during his administration has kind of been proliferated throughout the administration's following. This is policy, Roger, that has become part of basically every administration, whether it be his policy on China or the idea that he prevented conflict and tried to end conflict and did in many instances. I think, Roger, you know it best that Richard Nixon is one of the best presidents in the history of our country. And the proof there is that they tried to get rid of him because, as we know, with President Donald Trump, every time that somebody stands in the way of those who want to sell out our country, those who want to make sure that our industries leave our shores for foreign nations, that we are taken advantage of at every turn, the Obamas, the Clintons, those people are fine with that. You notice they stayed in office. There were no scandals. They barely even, with Obama, he claims famously no scandals. As we know, not the truth. But my point is that they push these things under the rug for people that do their bidding. Richard Nixon did not do their bidding, and it's why he had to be destroyed. You know that better than anybody, Roger.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was working for both Donald Trump and Richard Nixon, they met each other for the first time. It was in George Steinbrenner's box, Yankee Stadium, on opening day. And I heard from both of them afterwards. But it was Nixon first who said, well, I met your friend Trump. I said, what did you think, sir? He said, very impressive, very impressive. If he ever decided to get into politics, he could go all the way. And I said, well, do you mean be elected governor? He said, no, I mean all the way. And of course, that very day, he wrote a letter which has been published by the New York Times directly to Trump, telling him that if he pursued a political career, that he would be successful, and that that President and Mrs. Nixon had watched Trump. I think it was on the Mike Douglas show. Were very impressed with him. And of course, Trump has spoken about his admiration and his understanding of Nixon. I do see a lot of the same quality, the strength, the indestructibility, the indefatigability of both of them. So I think you make an excellent point. Let's move to modern day politics. You've written an incredible piece on Mitch McConnell. Now, I honestly don't know whether Mitch McConnell, the senator from Kentucky, the longest serving majority leader of the Senate, no longer majority leader, I have no idea whether he is still with us or not. They have produced these photographs of him, but the photographs are immediately picked apart by online sleuths using AI and pointing out that they appear to have been created using artificial intelligence. That's a good place to start. I mean, Troy, do you have any theory as to whether the senator is really with us? It's possible, of course, that he's physically alive. In other words, they're keeping him on artificial respiration, but he may no longer be with us mentally, or perhaps he's in terrific shape. I really don't know, but I find it suspicious. Why would you not just hold a press conference and let the press see you and announce that you're fine if you are indeed fine?
Well, that's exactly right, Roger. And we've seen this with the president. We know that there are certain measures that can be taken to, take action against the president who is deemed by his cabinet and members of Congress being not of sound mind. But I'm not aware of any stipulation that allows us to do the same thing for sitting members of Congress. We've seen this problem time and time again, whether it was Dianne Feinstein or others that are in office for extended periods of time where we're not really even sure if they're alive or not. The truth is, Roger, you're exactly right. We don't know whether Mitch McConnell is alive or dead, but we do know that in the last few years of the votes that he's taken, he has taken ardent stances against President Donald Trump. And in this crucial time, Roger, I think the mainstream media is, for the most part, Democrats are depicting this as, oh, this is going to help Republicans. Well, if we look at Mitch McConnell's voting history in the last year, he has not been a pro-Trump Republican. He's been actually an anti-Trump Republican, siding with Democrats on key legislation. So with the Save America Act looming, with all this stuff kind of up in the air, I believe McConnell is being kept around, whether that's alive or dead, to be a useful tool for the people that he has been a useful tool for his entire career. And I know we're going to get into that more here now, but throughout his career, Roger, Mitch McConnell has taken every step necessary to destroy America's industry. When we drive through America today and we see emptied factories and bombed out buildings that once stood as industry, the bleeding heart of America, the beating heart of America, that heart is dead because of Mitch McConnell, who has allowed China to rape this country over and over and over again with economic policies that allow them to come in, undercut our industry, and basically allow them to do this over an extended period of time. I don't know how far we want to get into the weeds right now, but we could go back to 2000, where Mitch McConnell takes a vote to allow China into the World Trade Organization, paving the way for that. He also, in that bill, allows China to have lowered tariffs on key industries. And it's not until President Trump emerges in 2018 that McConnell takes this big stance on tariffs. Oh, Trump can't put tariffs on the people. He said he's scared about the way that tariffs are being used. Well, that's because these are a response to China's taking of our industry, using their own tariffs to flood our markets with cheap products that America can't compete with and Americans can't compete with. So when Donald Trump comes along and takes a stand against Mitch McConnell and these Republicans who have done this for decades on end, that's when they have the problem, Roger. And if we're just going back to that 2025 vote, Mitch McConnell voted with Democrats and with several other Republicans to take away President Trump's power to levy tariffs. And we're going to get into the China connections here today. But if we want to talk about what Mitch McConnell's useful for today, it's not for President Trump. And I just want to get your thoughts on that, because he's betrayed us, I think, at every level here.
No, as you point out, that early in his career, he was a county judge before being elected to the United States Senate. That was in 1985. And early in his career, he was a pretty hardline anti-communist, anti-Chinese communist, pretty much your standard conservative Republican from the border south. But he was also, at the time of his election, worth between $200,000 and $300,000. Today, according to his financial disclosures, he's worth $35 million. That's kind of curious. But then the change in his public positions, the change in his positions in the U.S. Senate, all seem to begin when he marries Elaine Chao. Now, Elaine Chao was the longest-serving member of the Bush cabinet, where she served as labor secretary. Then, after Mitch McConnell talked Donald Trump into it, she served as the transportation secretary in Donald Trump's first term. But as you point out, and I was pretty surprised to see, Elaine Chao has some very, very close ties to the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, absolutely, Roger. Her father is a man named James C. Chang Chao. He founded a shipping company called the Foremost Group. It is an international shipping company founded in 1964. This is no small shipping company, Roger. They have 30 cargo ships worldwide, and the company is worth $1.2 billion. This is a guy that was a classmate, a schoolmate of a man named Jiang Zemin, who was a CCP general secretary and actually served as the president of China. That's just her father, Roger. If we look at her sister, who passed away in 2024, and what many have reached out to me following this piece and saying very questionable death with Angela Chao, who died in a car accident in 2020.
We seem to have. It's interesting reading here from the work of our guest, Troy Smith. Angela Chao served on the board of the City Holding Company of the China State Shipbuilding Corporation, a major Chinese state-owned defense conglomerate central to the People's Republic of China. This would have been the sister-in-law to Senator Mitch McConnell. The Chao family is extremely wealthy, influential, with serious direct ties to national security elements within the Chinese Communist Party. So when you understand where Elaine Chao comes from, perhaps you now understand where Mitch McConnell's views have shifted. It is pretty well known that they were introduced by a man named Stu Block. Stu Block is a longtime friend of Mitch McConnell's. He's a real estate expert with extreme political influence. They were married, and almost immediately, Stu Block's wife was appointed to a post as ambassador to Nepal by George H.W. Bush. Troy, you are back with us.
Absolutely, Roger. And the company here is major. They have major ties with Angela Chao to the China State Shipbuilding Corporation, which builds ships for the People's Liberation Army Navy. So we're talking about major defense organizations linked to Elaine Chao's sister, their father also being the head of a major shipping company that is also tied to the CCP. And when we examine how these people were even introduced, Roger, we come across another individual named Julie Chang Block, married to a Stu Block. That's the couple that introduced Elaine Chao. Julie Chang Block is the mentor of Elaine Chao. It's how the connection was made. And she's linked to USAID, who was exposed by Elon Musk as being completely fraudulent. She served as a senior role at USAID. Not only that, Roger, but she's actually the founder of the United States China Education Trust, which routinely attacks President Trump for his tariff policies towards China. So across the board here, Chang Block is also a Chinese immigrant, came from China. These people have heavy ties in every way to the CCP. They have heavy ties to Chinese military intelligence officials. And to suggest Mitch McConnell goes from $200,000 worth in 1984 to then $35 million in 2026. How did he get that money? Well, he got it from the family of Elaine Chao, who I've just laid out for you here, Roger, is completely intertwined with the CCP and military operations over in China. You couldn't have a more compromised individual, and you have to ask, how has this not come up? It's been pretty open knowledge. I want to get your thoughts on that as somebody who's been around politics for a long time. People know that China Mitch is a real thing. This guy has serious ties to China, no?
This is why people need to go to slingshot.news, where you have written extensively. It's the first time I've ever seen all this laid out in such a logical and documented way. You're listening to The Roger Stone Show here on the Red Apple Audio Networks, and we'll be right back with more politics on the other side.
This is The Roger Stone Show. This is The Roger Stone Show.
A man who's gone through hell, but he's kept going, and he's smart, and he's strong, and people love him. Not everybody, but people love him and respect him. Roger Stone.
Now, here's Roger Stone.
And we're back in the Stone Zone right here on the Roger Stone Show. We're talking to Troy Smith, the editor and publisher of slingshot.news. Troy, it's strange because without any question, without Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump could not have avoided impeachment. Without Mitch McConnell, he could not have confirmed the Supreme Court justices that were confirmed, although at least one of them, I think, was a mistake, perhaps two. But in both those cases, Mitch McConnell did his party duty. Now you have a situation under which were the seat to be vacated, in other words, were Mitch McConnell to resign or be declared deceased, the governor would be allowed to appoint someone to fulfill the rest of the term. The rest of the term only runs until January of next year, but as long as he is technically still alive, that seat remains in Republican hands, although Mitch McConnell has not showed up to vote quite some time. The Republicans have already nominated Andy Barr, who's a congressman from the 6th District of Kentucky, with the endorsement of President Donald Trump. So there's no doubt in a state as red a state as Kentucky will hold this seat. But I'm wondering whether this entire charade is really built around just avoiding the appointment of a Democrat senator, because the governor of Kentucky is a Democrat, whether that is perhaps what's really going on here.
There's a real stays Republican as long as McConnell's
there's a real chance that that's the case, Roger. And I want to point out here, though, that the crux of this story, and I think the real point that we want to hammer across to people is that just because Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell are Republicans doesn't mean that they agree on everything. And when you read this article, Roger, as I know you did, and so many people have reached out over this, you find the steps that Mitch McConnell and Republicans in what we would call the Rhino class, what they did to carve up this country prior to Trump being the only person in American politics to have the guts to stand up to them and speak out against the unbelievable trade deficits during the first time he ran for president, his first campaign. He's the only person, to my knowledge, to this date, that has had the guts to call them out for what they did in carving up this country. And I think when we get down to the crux of what they are and what they support, it is imperative when we're looking at Mitch McConnell's successor, whoever that may be, that they are going to be somebody that represents the wing of the party that sent Donald Trump to the White House in 2024 with one of the most resounding election victories we've ever seen, with 7 swing state victories. It's Trumpism that achieved that, not the rhinoism of Mitch McConnell. And I want to just make that clear that Republican, Democrat, we can get into the politics of this, and yes, there is a Democrat governor, and I think you're exactly right that Republicans will maintain or retain that seat in the coming election. But the point is, when you have a situation where we're picking a successor, it has to be somebody who is truthfully going to represent that wing of the party instead of the wing that, like I said, sold out this country, carved up our industry, and created this crisis. You know, there's so many jobs, Roger, that were lost, of the 5 million manufacturing jobs that were lost as a result due to this the policy. That's 5 million people who went on to be hooked on opiates or turned to lives of crime or any of the number of problems that plague the middle of this country. Those people are in that situation because of people like Mitch McConnell. And I would like to see, and I know you would like to see too, a Republican Party that represents those people and their interests and doesn't continue to sell them out to foreign interests for whatever reason it may be. And when you examine this record of Mitch McConnell and his ties to China through Elaine Chao, his rise in monetary and his wealth and all that, coupled with the policies that have allowed China to do what they've done, I don't think that there truthfully is an excuse for it. It is terrible, and it's a true betrayal, not just of the American way, but of the American people, especially in Kentucky. I mean, I just can't imagine a worse fate for those people than to have somebody who's so against the American ideal. And whoever does replace McConnell, I hope, if it is Andy Barr, I have confidence that he will be a much better representative of what we want the Republican Party to look like going forward. I'd like to get your thoughts on that as well.
To the SAVE Act, I think, speaks volumes. That's not a trade policy. Now, I think Republicans can have legitimate differences on trade policy. Our party's always had more than one wings. But opposition to the SAVE Act, which is a simple provision that says you have to be a U.S. citizen and you have to have a photo ID to vote, you can only oppose that out of your hatred for Donald Trump and your hatred for the country. All right, we have to leave it there. I want to thank our guest, Troy Smith. Go to slingshot.news to check out his writing. Until next week, God bless you and Godspeed.